All right, time for us to turn once again to another subject. With the government in Khartoum directly implicated in genocide, its delivery of basic services naturally leaves much to be desired. This makes the role played by the United Nations, aid workers, and humanitarian organizations all the more critical. The U.S. and other countries have pushed for a blue helmet UN peacekeeping force, as we've been discussing, to replace the beleaguered African Union force. Sudan is balking at that. Once again, let's take a look at John Sawyer's documentary chronicling his recent visit to the scene.
Now the United States is pressing for the United Nations to take over the AU mission, with more troops and a stronger mandate to protect the civilian victims of Darfur. Sudan's government is balking, stoking public fears of an Iraq-style foreign intervention. Calls for further UN sanctions against Sudan, meanwhile, are stymied by the opposition of countries like China, the major purchaser of Sudan's newfound oil.
Mudawi, when we see scenes like that, is that just a reflection of the power of the government in Khartoum to stage manage public opinion and make it look like the public is up in arms against any UN force coming in? Or is there a real opposition in Sudan to the presence of white foreigners, essentially?
One thing we have to understand about the Sudanese people, we don't have anti-foreign sentiments. These are rallies which have been mobilized by the government. Sudanese people in the history, we are the only nation which paid a farewell party to our colonizers. We have been colonized by 462 British. We don't have anti-sentiment and anti-foreign sentiments. And you have all these people coming from Western Africa, living in Sudan, coming from Ethiopia, coming from Eritrea. We are not. You have the Coptics, for example. We don't have any, this kind of anti-foreign sentiment.
When the British were there in the 19th century, and the Mahdi rose out of Darfur, and he came to power, and he threw out the British. I mean, there may not have been an anti-foreign sentiment, but when there was an army perceived as an army of occupation, people rose up. And I certainly agree that the government has done everything it could to create these demonstrations, and they're trying to stoke anti-foreign sentiment. But if there is an army that is perceived as a Western, particularly if it's an American army that came in, I think you'd see something similar to what you saw in Iraq, where I was in Iraq just before the war, and there was a sense that we would be perceived, as the Vice President said, as liberators. And we were for a few weeks, and then it quickly changed. And I think that would happen anywhere that you had a large-scale foreign presence on the ground.
I think the Mahdis had the revolt against Islamic country. It's Islamic state. It was against the Turkish. It wasn't against the British.
Michael,
the British came afterwards. But I think, for me, the problem is not troops, you don't need troops in Sudan. You need people to be engaged in a dialogue. If you have the African Union force with only 7,000, when they came and they stabilized the situation, they were very few. They were less than 3,000 people. They came and stabilized the situation where there was a negotiated, ceasefire. There was a hope that there is a solution.
Now, Mudawi has talked, Michael, about troops being able to accomplish only so much, and what you need is people on the grassroots level, if you will, or on the ground. You, however, or the Bush administration, I should say, are pushing for a UN peacekeeping force here that would be 12 to 20,000 men strong. What do we imagine that a UN force could accomplish by way of stopping the violence that's taking place, whether it's complex or organized or disorganized or what have you? It's there and it's happening. What do we imagine that a UN force could accomplish that the African Union couldn't?
Yeah. Well, as I indicated earlier, the African Union has, in effect, sort of reached the limit of its capabilities in dealing with this very complex situation. If you get a UN peacekeeping force in there, it will have more technical capabilities, it'll be a larger force, it'll be a better equipped force. Now, the African Union forces, however, would form the nucleus of that force. There would also be additional troop contributing countries. The way I would put it is this: you need an international peacekeeping force. Now the African Union, soon to be the United Nations peacekeeping operation, to stabilize the situation and stop the killing. The long-term solution to this, the only real viable solution, is a political settlement. And that's why we've been a very strong supporter of the Abuja peace talks. And it has been the United States, in fact, I've been watching this issue, I've been dealing with Sudan now for 4 years, that has mobilized really a very broad international coalition, including the European Union and virtually every state on the African continent, to press Khartoum and to support these international peacekeeping forces.
All right, let's go to our internet audience once again with a question from Laura, who asks, realistically, how long will it take for the UN to deploy a peacekeeping force? And she also asks about NATO. We're going to come back to NATO. Michael, once again, do you have very quickly, any ideas on how long it'll be before we actually see one? Obviously, the Sudanese government has something to say about this.
Right. Well, again, there are two parts here. One is to strengthen the existing African Union force, and that can be done immediately. We're already taking some steps to do that. In terms of deployment of a UN force, realistically, these things do take time. If a UN Security Council resolution was approved tomorrow, it would most likely be 6 to 9 months before a UN force was on the ground.
Yeah, the other point there, James, worth noting is that the United Nations is already in southern Sudan. There's a UN mission in Sudan that's already been approved. There isn't any of this dispute that we have on the mission in Darfur.
And how's it doing?
And yet, well, it's only about, I think Ambassador Ranneberger knows the number better than I, but I think it's about 70% there. Right. And it's taken much longer to get it up to speed. And they're not really